I generally believe that anything that you can put in a nutshell probably belongs there. The early 20th century Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I will give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity." There are topics, even when they're summed up nicely, that require wading into the weeds a bit. That general warning being issued, there is a T-shirt that I really like, which allows the wearer to proclaim to the world, "Love is love, Black Lives Matter, climate change is real, immigrants make America great, and women's rights are humans' rights." Now, I could turn that into a weekend conference with 6 lectures, 3 hours of music, and a beer garden. But these are conclusions. They're conclusions that are familiar to all of us, but most of them took even us a while to get there. These are important truths, but we have to do a lot of convincing to get most folks who go to church to wear a shirt like that. The conclusions are simple and straightforward, but the process of arriving at them requires thoughtful analysis. You have to have critical thinking skills, and you have to have a willingness to change your mind, to accept new information. And one more thing, truly, to wade into the neurological weeds a little bit, you have to have the ability to hear it, to understand, appropriate the information, and everyone isn't able to do that. So I'd like to engage in just a little memory exercise with you. Just repeat this sentence after me. Ich bin gekommen, auf das zu leben und weil genug gehabt. And see, we'll try it again. We'll try it a little differently. I have come that you may have life and have it more abundantly.
I have come that you may have life and have it more abundantly.
The same sentence. First version is in German, the second is in English. And unless you speak German, there's not a wrinkle in your brain for German words. You let a German sentence slip right past the clean wax floor of your brain without leaving any muddy footprints. It's easy to remember in English because we have those categories already in our brain. New ideas, alternative ways of seeing, even new facts, often will slip right past us until we have heard them over and over again. That's why advertisements, if they're ever really going to work, have to be repeated to the point that they're maddening. But if it's new information, you have to hear it and hear it and hear it in order to hold on to it. Now, you may hate the whole political correctness thing that constantly demands that you show sensitivity in language. But folks, the truth is, words matter. Words are how we learn. They're how we remember things. Words create categories in our brains so that we can understand what we are experiencing in the world and remember it. Let me give you an example. This is a Patagonian toothfish, and I wish I had a picture of it from the front because it is all teeth. This fish lives in the very cold waters near Antarctica. It can live 50 years, grow to be 7 feet long, weighs 200, 220 pounds. It had almost no commercial value. You have not, after all, ever seen a Patagonian toothfish mentioned on a menu. However, some bright marketing guy decided to call it a Chilean sea bass. And even though it's neither Chilean nor a sea bass, it became so popular that we have now nearly eaten them into extinction. You may think that you would not like a Patagonian toothfish. Doesn't sound tasty. But it turns out if you just call it something more palatable, it's very tasty. A lot of our prejudices and beliefs and even our lifestyles are based on the categories in our heads that are created by the language that we use. The most common meats in America are beef, chicken, and pork, but in the Middle East, the staple meat is camel. In Ecuador, it's guinea pig and iguana. I have had camel in Egypt. I've had guinea pig in Ecuador. And I can assure you that it does not taste at all like chicken. But it's a matter of what you believe about animals and how those categories have been established in your brain. When I started graduate school in 1978 at Vanderbilt, we were told during our entering student orientation that if we made a male reference to God in any of our papers, that we would be given one chance to correct it, and after that, we would get an F. Now, prior to that orientation, in August of 1978, I had never called God anything but Father. And the use of masculine pronouns to mean both men and women was just universal in the language in which I lived. It wasn't easy to change, and the emphasis my professors put on this way of speaking seemed to me to be, well, it was radical, but it also seemed grossly exaggerated. That we were liberals, we were academics, you know, we insisted on uncertainty and inquiry about anything except the gender of God. We knew for a fact that God had no gender. But in 1978, I can also tell you that I had never seen a woman pastor. And not only was God called Father, but so were Catholic priests and Episcopal priests. The language of the church, our hymns, our liturgies, they were all male-centered. And while you may not think that that makes much of a difference, it wasn't until we changed our language, in my case by force, that we began to see changes in the roles of women in the church. Now, you may have never noticed in our prayers and liturgies and our hymns here at this church that we assiduously avoid using gender-specific language, and the fact that you never notice it only proves the point that it's become normal for us. Our language sets the mental stage that has allowed us to make progress in progressive thinking. You change the way you speak, and you subtly, eventually, change the way you think. People who've been indoctrinated into the white, heterosexual, male patriarchy of traditional Christianity are absolutely confident of their worldview, and they believe that their beliefs are virtually universal. Now, they don't believe that love is love unless it's between a man and a woman. They would also not be inclined to say that Black lives matter because they are confident that they would say all lives matter in sort of an Animal Farm sort of way. All lives matter except that white lives matter a little more than other lives. And for them, the Genesis creation narrative that describes the creation of a flat earth that is the center of everything is a substantial truth. And climate change scientists are just a fad among scientists. Now, this illustration is a drawing of the earth as it's described in the second chapter of Genesis, or in the first chapter of Genesis, rather. But a flat earth with an underworld underneath the flat part and a firmament that was solid. There was an arch above, and stars and moon were attached to that, and the heavens were above, and angels opened gates to let water above the firmament rain down below. Now, you wouldn't go to a conservative church and find many people that would want to say that that's the earth as the Bible describes it, but that is how the Bible describes it. What that sets you up for is to be suspicious of facts, that you invest your belief in the Bible as a book that God wrote and everything in it is holy and just, and that doesn't fit with even a high school world science class, but you learn to constantly live in a fact-free way of thinking, that if you invest yourself in believing that the Bible was written by God and that everything it says has to be true, then the persuasive ability of scientists to speak to us, to teach us, is always suspect, and people can say, well, that's your opinion. Just as our senators and our congressmen will, or congresspersons, will often say, well, I'm not a scientist. Well, yeah, you're not a scientist, but you're making laws to govern science and environmental conclusions and things. For them, science is possibly interesting, but this is a fact, even if they wouldn't point to this and say it's a fact. For them, then, immigrants are simultaneously, especially for Christian conservatives, immigrants are a reason for charity, but simultaneously something to be feared. And women's rights are not really on the radar. I mean, they may talk a good game, talk about being loving and devoted and sacrificing for one another, but there's always a top-tier gender and a second-tier gender. Still, religious people always think of themselves as being good people, don't they? They think that going to church, attending Bible study, enduring sermons, and generally singing really bad hymns is somehow feeding their souls, literally making themselves look more attractive to God. But let's be honest, for the most part, being indoctrinated into traditional religious life makes you prejudiced against homosexuals. It supports a white, male, racist patriarchy. It makes you impervious to scientific facts. It fosters nationalism. And what I'm really on about today is it creates a universe of values in which women are not only paid less, passed over for promotions, sexually exploited, but, and this is crucial, it creates a universe of thinking in which domestic violence is a private matter that is somehow excusable. Amen. I'm not trying to be flip about this by quoting Mark Twain, but when he said, what gets us into trouble is not what we don't know, it's what we're sure of that just ain't so. That describes the fundamental problem with religious indoctrination. This is Valentine's Day weekend or week, and I suggested to Sean that we have love songs for our service today. And I really meant to do, when I wrote my notes for this month, I really meant to do more of a straight-up message about love relationships. But you know what, folks? Honestly, I did that last year on this Sunday, and I think it was a clever, witty sermon. So you can just go back on YouTube and look up February 12th of 2017, and if what you want is kind of a Valentine's Day themed sermon, I think that's a good one. I'll stand by it. But the truth that kept dawning on me this week is that love relationships oftentimes turn into something very toxic. They start out with kisses and a diamond ring and a ceremony, and usually there's some kids and a house, but underneath all of that, there can be a cancer that grows. It literally grows in the shadow of love. And folks, this is our business. Churches often feed the cancer more than they feed the love. When I was a grad student doing my supervision and counseling training, I was serving at a county seat church in Russellville, Kentucky. I was just a block up the street from Sacred Heart Catholic Church. So for a host of reasons, I became the de facto therapist for local Catholics. And one of my weekly regulars was a very little woman, a former nun, who had left the convent to marry. And she was a nurse at our hospital, a mother, and a very active member of the Catholic parish. But I came into my office one day and found her sitting by my desk, as she often was, her face badly bruised, but this time one eye was swollen shut, and she was bent over, breathing with great difficulty because most of her ribs were broken. Her concern that day was that her supervisor at the hospital would not believe that she had fallen down the stairs again. I begged her to let me call a lawyer and start the process of divorce, and she emphatically said no. She had been down the hill to see Father Thomas before she came to my office, and he had told her that the violence in her marriage was the cross that she had to bear. She added that it was punishment for having broken her vow to the order when she left the convent. So you see, it wasn't just her husband who was beating her. It was her church. And by inference, it was a judging, wrathful, Heavenly Father. Now, I wish I could say that I can bury that memory in rural Kentucky from 40 years ago, but my weekly discipline of serving lunch at our local domestic abuse shelter keeps my experience more current. Every week, there are women in line with their arm in a sling, with bruises on their face, often shepherding small children who cling to them. And I try to joke with the kids, give them milk or extra brownies or cookies, but a lot of those kids are just scared of men, and with good reason. Every man in their life has been violent. The brief conversations we have with the residents often reveal that they are church folk, but I could have guessed that already. A woman I met at the shelter last week told me that she and her husband had gone to see their pastor for counseling about the violence in their home. They went several times, and the pastor kept telling her if she would only be more submissive, if she could only be more obedient, that he in turn would be a better husband. And she finally began trying to leave him, but each time he would call and remind her that she would go to hell if she divorced him. And when that stopped working, he started making suicide gestures to manipulate her with guilt. And folks, you have to realize religion has a kind of guilt, a quality of guilt that is just so insidious and deep. Church folk can be so easily led to their own disaster through the use of guilt. I was in a meeting recently that was supposed to be an educational meeting for pastors about domestic violence. And the woman who spoke to us about, there were two women that spoke to us about their horrific experiences. They all included having gone to talk to either their Catholic priest or their Pentecostal pastor. And the event was dominated by students from our local Pentecostal university and members from a local Pentecostal church. And they all kept referring to God as Father and to Jesus as being God and reiterating their beliefs about God's will and God's deliverance and God's ability to change a home. All of them had gone back to a male-dominated religion that had been the genesis of their problems. That male-dominated religion creates the misogynistic worldview that makes domestic violence not only possible, but defensible, and continues to tell women that they have to keep enduring it. They were set up for abuse by a patriarchal view of faith, and they had all gone right back into the lion's den of their familiar, abusive, and patriarchal churches. And I know that some of you would wish that I had kept quiet in that meeting, but I can assure you that I did not. And I hope you wouldn't either, because we have to start confronting patriarchy or it'll never end. Now, I was on this topic before the news about Rob Porter broke this week, and Porter has his own religious chapter to his narrative. He's a Mormon, and he was violent with his first wife, and they went to their Mormon church for direction, and the direction was for her to stick with him until he became a better husband. It is easy for us to point to high-profile cases of wife beaters, but I don't want for us to let this topic get lost only in the extremes. Domestic violence is common. It's not a disease found only among the poor and the uneducated. In my 40 years of experience in ministry, the family home that I was called out to the most often was a home of two physicians who never seemed to get violent enough to call the police, but they were violent. There was enough punching and slapping going on that their in-house nanny called me regularly to act like I just happened to show up at the house at 11:30 at night to sit and chat to get the violence to stop. Domestic violence happens in trailer parks, and it happens in gated communities with astonishingly similar frequency. Rob Porter, the secretary to the President of the United States, who lost his job this week, was the kind of guy that people like to look up to. He was a veteran. He was a star graduate of Harvard Law School. But he had multiple cases of violence with women in his past, but never seemed to give off clues to the people that worked around him. And when I chose the lyrics of John Lennon's All You Need Is Love for the wisdom lesson today, I was unaware that Lenin wrote these works about peace and love as sermons to himself because he was ashamed of the violence that was in his first marriage and in the other women that he dated when he was younger. It's a simple thing to despise a member of the Trump administration. Everybody here can do that. We can turn on Rob Porter in a nanosecond. But do you want to turn on John Lennon? I mean, I really had to struggle with whether we should still do the song today because he was guilty of domestic violence. But that just, to me, adds to the complexity of the whole thing, that there are people who can be good and do good things in most dimensions of their life, and they have a dimension of their life that's cancerous, that's toxic, that must be extinguished. And we have a horrible problem with domestic violence in Springfield. Our shelter, Harmony House, has been full with a waiting list for most of its existence. While the majority of the residents are women with children, there are also some men and many gay and lesbian people whose domestic relationship has also become toxic. And again, there's a religious chapter to that. If your church has taught you to loathe yourself and to loathe the kind of relationship that you crave, it's not hard to see how that loathing expresses itself as violence. But it can happen to anyone. The shelter in Kansas City has evolved towards investing more of their budget in prevention than they have over housing victims. They're realizing that to reduce domestic violence, that they literally need to be in the schools teaching elementary students and middle school students, that they need to know the warning signs when a romantic partner becomes too jealous or too controlling. And now with cell phones, it's so easy to constantly text or call. Where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing? Excesses of this sort should send up warning flags, even if you're only 13, 14, 15 years old and just starting to have a relationship. People who are controlling are likely to become abusive. And quite frankly, one of the few things that we see about mass shootings in the United States is that almost all of them were also guilty of domestic abuse. That this is a profound problem that we need to pay attention to. But my concerns go back even farther than the shelter in Kansas City. As a pastor, my concern is with the training children receive when they're sitting on little painted chairs like I did. My own training in misogyny started right here in my kindergarten class in the basement of the First Christian Church in Glasgow, Kentucky. I was the cute one in the back row. This is not about political correctness. It's not about hypersensitivity to using the right word to avoid other people's too easily hurt feelings. It's about changing the world so that love doesn't get distorted into violence. It's about changing church culture and changing school culture and changing work culture so that we don't need 150 beds in this small city for victims of domestic violence. The words that we use reflect the way that we think, and the way that we think creates the culture in which we live. And the culture, as we have created it right now, is not an especially safe place for women, even women who are in love. I think it's time for us to literally hold a funeral for patriarchal thinking, patriarchal speaking, and especially for patriarchal religion. And maybe then we'll get to a place where love is all we need. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.